This is the story of the 2001 Avjet Aspen crash. On the 29th of March 2001, a chartered Gulfstream 3 owned by Avjet arrived at Los Angeles International Airport at 3:49 p.m. The plane was to take 15 passengers to the Aspen Pitkin County Airport in Colorado. When the plane did get to LAX, the passengers were still nowhere to be seen, and the captain of the plane was talking to other captains about the flight. In particular, the issues with landing at Aspen. You see, the Aspen airport had a nighttime landing restriction, meaning that this particular plane would not be able to land there 30 minutes after sunset. You see, the plane did not meet certain noise restrictions and thus could not land after 6:58 p.m. that day, local time. Eventually, the plane got underway at 5:11 p.m., delayed 41 minutes due to the late arrival of the passengers. The flight was 1 hour and 35 minutes long, meaning that they'd be landing at 6:46 p.m., pretty close to the curfew. At about 6:31 p.m., the captain says, "Well, there is the edge of night right there." He was aware that they'd be cutting it close. The captain and the co-pilot talk about sunset times for Aspen, making sure that they'd have enough time to land. So far, it looks like they'll make it with the smallest of margins. At 6:37 p.m., the first officer calls for the approach briefing. They're going to go over the landing that they're going to make. The captain is concerned about the fuel he has on board. He says that they'll try one approach into Aspen, and if that doesn't work, they'll try to land at Rifle, their alternate airport. At 6:44 p.m., they made contact with Aspen Approach. They talked to the controller about traffic in the area. The crew tried to find a highway that they used as a visual landmark as the plane flew towards the airport. At 6:48 p.m., the captain sees the highway. He indicates that he's ready to begin the approach, but the co-pilot still cannot see the highway. The captain tells the flight attendant that in case they don't make this approach, they're going to head for Rifle because it would be too late in the day to try again. At 6:51 p.m., the approach controller asks the Gulfstream to turn to 050 degrees. And then a few minutes later, the controller asks the Gulfstream to turn to 140 degrees and maintain 16,000 feet. They were about to intercept the final approach onto Aspen. At 6:53 p.m., the flight attendant asks if someone can sit in the jump seat, and a male passenger enters the cockpit. He can be heard buckling in. As the passenger buckles in, approach control asks another plane to execute a missed approach. The captain says the weather has gone down. They're not making it in, and an unidentified male voice in the cockpit stated, "Oh, really?" At 6:56 p.m., the controller cleared the Gulfstream for the VOR/DMA-C approach. He tells them that they're about 5 miles from the red table VOR, which is their initial approach fix. We've talked about approach fixes before on this channel. When you reach an approach fix point, your plane must be at a particular speed and a particular height. The controller also adds that they have to be above 14,000 feet for this point. At 6:56 and 23 seconds, the first officer says, "After VOR, you are cleared to 12,700. The controller makes a broadcast about the weather. The visibility north of the airport is at 2 miles. At 6:57, the crew established control with local control. The local control tells the crew that they're following a Challenger that was 2 miles from the runway. Wind is at 240 at 5 knots. Pretty calm, they're good to go. Runway 15 is all theirs. At 6:58 p.m., the Challenger in front can't see the runway and goes around. The male voice in the cockpit says, "Are we clear?" The captain replied, "Not yet, and the guy in front of us didn't make it either." The captain asks for his next step down altitude. When you're not doing an ILS approach, especially in bad weather, pilots use steps to get down to the runway. You fly level, reach a predetermined point, and then you descend again. At 6:59 p.m., the captain calls for landing gear. The plane was at 10,400 feet, and the captain asks the controller if the lights were all the way up, and the controller confirms that the runway lights were as bright as they could be. After this, the first officer allowed the captain to get down to 10,200 feet, the minimum descent altitude. At 7 p.m., the captain asked the first officer if he can see the runway. No answer was received. The plane was now at 10,000 feet. The controller asked them if they had the runway in sight. About 2 seconds later, the first officer stated, "Affirmative," and the captain stated, "Yes, now, yeah, we do." About 1 second afterward, the first officer advised the controller that the runway was in sight. At 7:01 p.m., the plane's configuration warning goes off, letting the pilots know that the plane isn't configured for landing. Maybe the flaps aren't all the way out, or they're just going too fast. The plane calls out 1,000, and the first officer states 1,000 to go. The automated calls continue 900, 800. The captain says, "Where's it at?" The automated callouts continue 700, 600. The co-pilot says, "To the right." Seconds later, they hit 500 feet and the GPWS warning sounds. The plane starts a left turn and the sink rate warning now comes on. The automated voice says 400. The engines were ramped up to full power. The voice says 300. Soon after the 200 callout comes, the plane is still in a left bank, now 40 degrees, wing down. The plane soon crashes into the ground 2,400 feet from the runway. All 18 on board were killed. The investigators looked at the actions of the pilots on the night of the crash. The pilots knew about the restriction in place at Aspen. They knew they had to make it in before 6:58 p.m. The pilots even did talk about heading for rifle if their first approach was not successful. When they carried out the visual approach, they tried to find a highway that was near the runway, which took a lot longer than they expected. With the highway being hard to spot, the pilots shifted to an instrument approach. According to the restrictions in place, the plane should not have attempted the approach, but due to the vague way in which the restriction was worded, the pilots thought that they could shoot one approach. The tower did not have the restriction notum, and so the tower did not mention this to the pilots. At the start of their instrument approach, they decided to use the step-down method to land. They first had to maintain at least 14,000 feet when they passed the red table VOR. They then had to maintain 12,700 feet while passing the intermediate fixed position. So far so good, the crew seemed to be on the approach. But by the time they crossed the intermediate position fix, it was already 6:58 p.m. They had to abandon the approach. But maybe due to the bad wording of the notum, they thought that they could get one approach. At this point, 3 planes before the Gulfstream had missed approaches, yet no talk about a missed approach was to be found on the CVR. The final part of the step-down approach needs the plane to be at 12,200 feet while passing Alex, a waypoint. After this, they can get down to 10,400 and then 10,200 feet. But when the plane crossed Alex, they were at 12,100 feet, 100 feet below the prescribed altitude. At 7 p.m., the captain says, "I'm breaking out," meaning that he probably saw the ground for the first time. They were now at 10,400 feet. They descended again, but they were now flying 300 feet below the minimum altitude. They still probably did not have the runway in sight. This is when the captain asked the controller if the lights were as bright as they could get. Soon afterwards, the plane descended again. The controller, seeing that they were well below the minimum altitude, asked them if they had the runway in sight, to which they replied, "Affirmative." Evidence suggests that the flight crew probably did not have the runway in sight. By the time they were at the step-down fix point 9.5 DME south of Red Table, they were a staggering 900 feet below the minimums. At 7:01 p.m., the plane's configuration alarm sounded. This warning indicated that the captain had deployed the spoilers after the landing gear had been extended, and the final landing flaps had been selected. The airplane passed the mid-approach point at about 7:01 p.m. at an altitude of about 8,300 feet. The first officer was required to call out "missed approach point, runway in sight," or "missed approach point, runway not in sight," and the captain was required to announce his intentions. However, the CVR did not record either of these callouts. The captain says, "Where is it at?" signifying that he had no idea where the runway was. As they got closer, the pilot started turning the plane to the left to line up with the runway. They probably had the runway in sight at this point. But the bank angle kept increasing till the left wing smashed into the snow-covered terrain. The CVR contained no indication regarding why the plane was turning so steeply to the left. It is possible that the captain saw the runway or the highway and was making a steep turn to align the airplane with the runway without a substantial overshoot. It is also possible that the captain was starting to see terrain that had been obscured by the darkness and the weather conditions and was banking the airplane to avoid the terrain. The story does not end there. Yes, the crew made mistakes, but during the investigation, they found that the crew was under extreme stress. The passengers arriving late put the crew under a lot of pressure. They now had even less time to make it into an airport that had a fast approaching curfew. Adding to this, the charter may have been pressuring the crew to land at Aspen. This placed additional stress on the crew. According to the customer's business assistant, his employer became irate when he was informed of the possible diversion to an alternate airport. The assistant also stated that he was told to call Avjet and emphasized that the plane was not going to be redirected. The Avjet scheduler indicated that the captain felt that it was important to land at Aspen because of the substantial amount of money that the customer had paid for a dinner party. The pressure imposed by the passengers on the crew might have made the crew attempt a landing that they might not have otherwise attempted. In the end, the accident was due to the crew not paying that much attention to their altitude, which led them to descend below the minimum descent altitude. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to Curious Plane Spotter for letting me use his amazing videos on my video. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow.